So welcome everybody back to Friends of Tracking. As hopefully you know by now, tracking data. So this is all about tracking data, which is data that tells you the locations of all the players at all the times. And I'm Catherine Pfaff. I'm a math professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And we're here also with David Sumter, who's going to tell you a little bit about something before we jump into with our guest of the day. I'm very, very excited about because I've been reading his articles and just really enjoying them. So we're going to have Tom Worville here today from the Athletic. I had a few moments of a typo being up on Twitter on that, which was unfortunate. And he will tell you a little bit more about his background and how he got there and so on. But first, I think David wanted to jump in and tell you about something else exciting.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So before we start with Tom, what I thought I'd tell you about is, so a long time, we've been trying to do something where we have some kind of data available for the people who watch these videos and are involved in Friends and Tracking to work on. And it has proved incredibly difficult and actually impossible to get a tracking data set which we can share completely openly. But what we have managed to do is get some kind of half solution where we're going to start up what we call the Friends of Tracking research group. And if I share my screen here, and what this is a collaboration between Friends of Tracking, Skill Corner, who many of you know who provide tracking data, and 12 Football, which is a company which I co-run, which do various types of data analysis for TV and for clubs and things like that. And what we've managed to do is get together a data set, or actually a couple of data sets. And the data sets are snapshots based from event data of action. So event data is everything that happens with the passes on the ball, passes, interceptions, and so on. And I'll show you a few of these in a minute, but the basic idea is you can also supplement them with the Skills Corner positional data and velocity data. And we've got a full league of a full Premier League 1920 full season, which we at 12 actually internally use for some of our development. And then we've also got, we're going to have, because we haven't got them now because it starts tomorrow, we're going to have the Euro matches, and that will be released after the group stage and after the tournament. Now, so that's the good news. And here's the sort of, here's give you an idea what it was. I actually wrote an article. As I said, this is something we've been working with for a while. I wrote an article about some of the stuff we're doing today. And this is one of these snapshots. So there's a pass, which is this event data that went here. This is a match, Liverpool versus Everton. This is a pass from Wijnaldum to Mane, I think. And this is Firmino running in this direction. And what you have is actually the directions of all of the players. And you have the positions of all the players. And you also have the event data associated with that particular action. And so what you'll have if you're part of this group, this research group, is access to a Slack group on this, with this access to the data, and some degree of mentorship. I'm just saying it's not like a formal promise of some mentorship, but the people from Friends of Tracking, the earlier Friends of Tracking originators, will be part of this Slack group, and Catherine and I will be part of this Slack group, and we'll develop some projects together. Okay, so here comes the limitations. So here's the requirements. We were actually just talking about this with the maths requirement, and now I'm already coming with the maths requirement. So this is for people who have would like to use tracking data and event data in sport, and as part of or leading up to an undergraduate or master's project. So this is for people who are doing some sort of project as part of their education and would like to work with it. So you're not, I haven't finished this sentence, you're not full-time employed somewhere else, and you also are a student. So the idea of this is it's for students who would like to use tracking data and event data. I get quite a lot of emails about this, and I'll try and get back to people who've contacted me before and tell them about this. So you should have studied some basic maths courses which are needed for analyzing this type of data, Although it turns out everybody working for clubs doesn't know any calculus and doesn't seem to think they need to know any calculus, we found out last week. But you should know things like calculus, linear algebra, probability, or the type of machine learning data science approach to these types of things. I've also got this requirement: you should have watched the majority of the Friends of Tracking mathematical modeling of football videos. This is to do research after you've watched those things. And it's the sort of for people who are going to get going now, because we're going to limit this to 10 people to start off coming into this. There might be possibilities later, but please be something that you want to get started with now. The Euros are coming up and the data will come out. And this is the limitation, of course, and this is the unsolvable problem about tracking data, which is personal data. You'll not be able to share the data, but we will encourage you to share ideas and code with small amounts of data as an example. So there won't be overall data sharing, but you will be working together on the same data set. So what do? Well, you send me an email, David@12football, with your CV and a brief explanation of your requirements. This is really important. When you send this email to me, just bullet point how you fulfill those requirements. The one of 10 people maybe isn't one, but how you fill these first 4 requirements, so I know, and if you fulfill them, and then we'll see what we can do. And then I will reply to everybody who sends me an email and explaining that they do fulfill those requirements. So that, I think, is that. I will go back over to you, Catherine.
Okay, great. So I think we should just get started with Tom and let him. So we know he now works at The Athletic, writing brilliant articles, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about that. And then we're going to go through some of his articles actually that he's written.
Yeah. So, hi guys, I'm Tom. Thanks a lot for having me on. Yeah, I guess my journey today at The Athletic started at university, where I studied economics, as a few of your, I guess, attendees or guests in the last episode also have done, and studied economics at Leeds, and really just wanted to work in sports after graduating. So started, blogging, started a consultancy with, or like a podcast and various things with Sam Gregory, who you've had on, and Ben Torvany, who gets name dropped every single episode, I feel, and Bobby Gardner as well, who now consults with the club too. And from that was a good thing on my CV to join Opta. And at Opta, I spent a few years kind of working with clubs and the media and broadcast and betting, and a kind of really good, I guess, finishing school as an analyst to see how football data impacts everything, like the whole market. And then in February 2020, just before the pandemic hit, I joined The Athletic. Football stopped for months on end, and we had to get creative. But yeah, I'm now working for The Athletic. This is obviously Friends of Tracking, but I'm probably more Friends of Eventing, given the data that I will regularly use. But yeah, really excited to join you guys and have a chat about my work.
I was thinking today that the first when I wrote Soccermatics, and I think this was out before the book came out, the first ever interview I did was with you. I remember this today, and it was with Sam as well. You asked me to be on the Analytics podcast, and this was before the book came out, and talk about these things. And I have no idea what we talked about. I can't remember, but what I do remember is I had no idea what a podcast was. So you just sort of now obviously I know all about it, but we just started talking, and I thought like we'd talk a little bit and then it would be nice. I'd done TV interviews and radio interviews before and stuff, and it would all be sort of clipped nicely, but it was none of that. We just talked non-stop, and actually I think you and Sam did most of the talking, and I was just sort of trying to keep up.
Yeah, that will be somewhere on SoundCloud, buried in the internet.
Oh my
somewhere.
God.
So we could probably dig it out. So good. I'd like to think that we planted the seed for Friends of Tracking then all those years ago.
Yeah,
somehow.
Exactly. I think I've really changed over the years. I've really changed my approach to that. But I think what's interesting is, I mean, you really, when you coming into like how you got into this, you really kind of started with that blogging, and another thing is you sent me Pep's pitch, so Guardiola marks out, sorry, now I'm going to go into all of these things, but you said Guardiola marked out the pitch in a certain way with the half spaces and so on. And this was something I didn't know anything about. And you sent me some code in R, I think, to generate exactly this, this splitting up of the pitch. But that's how you got into it, with all this sort of amateur thing to start with. And then you've gone a long way.
Yeah, definitely. I guess just started doing what a lot of people do now, which is just experimenting with code and building different graphics and trying to get a following. And you know, I remember the days of you put something out and you just sit there like refreshing the page to see when you get a like, or you know, you've written a blog and you're up at 1 a.m. refreshing the WordPress dashboard to see if anyone's read it or commented and stuff. So yeah, I guess I just got a bit lucky that I happen to be the person who is like one of the only full-time analytics writers in the world, which is quite a weird thing. But yeah, it just again started out really when there was no public code, there was nothing, you know, like friends of tracking, there was no data. You had to kind of know a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who knew how to scrape who scored, who had it all in an Excel file. Whereas now, like, it's a lot more accessible. So yeah, I would have loved to get into this stuff probably now if I was kind of starting afresh, because like it's a lot easier, it's a lot more accessible. But yeah, I think you've seen a lot of analysts who started 5-6 years ago have all followed a similar sort of path and are in similar sort of jobs really as well.
I'm laughing because I just saw that Sam Goldberg said Tom's smile lights up a room. Anyway, I wasn't supposed to. I just got curious as to what was going on in the chat, and that was the first thing that jumped out.
Nice. That's very, very sweet of you, Sam. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you've got a lot of your fan club in there.
Yeah.
Okay. But I did actually notice also about when I was saying what tracking data was in the beginning, I was thinking about your articles, and I was like, actually, I'm not sure if you use tracking data as much as event data, but you do very clever, nice stuff with event data. So we're happy with
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is like it's a barrier, right? Like you guys have just announced then you've got a research group for 10 people with access to tracking data. Like it's tough to get, like it's hard to come across, and that the barriers will come down over time based on, you know, cost, based on just, you know, access. And at the moment, you know, you have guys like Skill Corner or, you know, Sportlogic and others, of course, who are collecting this data and selling it off league by league. But you also have like the league tracking deals between leagues, which again is all that data is locked up in clubs and it's proprietary and it's tough to get hold of. So yeah, I still think there's big barriers to that, but obviously you guys are doing huge things to just try and knock those down a little bit and make it accessible.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting things there, as I've been rereading some of your articles, partly to tell you which ones I most wanted you to talk about, and also just have some questions and so on. It did occur to me that there was, in some ways, this is like setting up for interesting, you know, like one could build off of what you did with this using tracking data. And so I was immediately, some things were jumping into my mind that one could do. So there, you've built actually a certain amount of, call it like infrastructure, right? Or something. You've created certain ways of looking at things in categories. There's a word that I give them, and so on. And so I think there's a lot that one could add to that. And I might ask some prodding questions about your thoughts as you go through it. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's certainly the case. I mean, you get to the end of any like bigger project and they're kind of like, you know, the feedback thing of like, how can I improve this or how would I do this differently? There's always there's one certain times when like editors or, you know, or like writers, when you show them something, come back and they'll be like, oh, you know, can we do this? Like, can we find out, let's say like a crossing piece, which we'll get to, you know, can we talk about how many players in the box? And it's like, well, yeah, we'd love to, but don't have the data, and if we could then so yeah, that's always a thought. And you have tracking data, you have a lot more questions you can answer, I guess, for sure.
Yeah, actually, because you were also saying in one of them things like, well, it's harder to know if, you know, I'm just looking at where the passes are to and from and how much press was there on this player or something like that. It could really impact whether that's going to be a successful pass. So
yeah, definitely.
Okay, so do you want to start with, I think you made a decision on which one of your articles you were going to start with, but did you want to just start going through it?
Yeah, I think we'll start with the 10 Commandments piece. let me know when you can see that. Mesut Ozil surrounded by some very suspect graphs. This one was one of the first pieces I wrote at the Athletic, actually, a couple of weeks in, 4-6 weeks into my time there. And I always had this bugbear for a while of you see stats on Twitter, you see them in the media, and you kind of think, that things are shown wrongly. And there's that classic thing of, lies. I can't remember it now, but essentially like statistics being like portrayed in the wrong fashion to essentially bend to whatever argument you want. If you guys can remember what I'm trying to think of.
Damned lies and statistics.
There we go. Exactly. One of you two had to get it, your professors. And we had a piece on the Athletic as well by Ben Baldwin, who is our kind of, I guess, my analog, but for American football. And he'd written a piece about the 10 commandments of football analysis, but obviously it's the egg-shaped ball, not the round one. And he kind of went through kind of, what are the numbers you use? What's QBR? Like, how do you rate running backs and things like this? And I just thought that's such a nice template to think of, numbers in our sport in that same sort of fashion. So there were 10 to start with. I'd probably maybe swap a couple of out. If I was doing this again, you could add probably 10 more to this, but I just thought it was a nice, like, bunch of things that have been rattling around my brain for a while, that I thought, let's get that out there and see if people agree, disagree, if they have others that they think are more, are worse examples. So the first is, thou shalt not use save percentage to evaluate a goalkeeper's shot stopping ability. And this one was always born out of seeing save percentage graphs on Sky Sports News or, any football stats aggregator on Twitter and kind of spitting it out and saying, oh, this guy's made the most saves, so therefore he's the best goalkeeper. But as a lot of things which I feel are like football analytics 101 at this point, volume and quality are like very different things, and they can also completely change. If you factor in quality, the volume can look completely different. And this one was a big one for me. So, being able to understand how many goals the keeper has saved based on a model which looks at the quality of on-target shots is arguably the better measure than just looking at raw save percentage. And you can also get more stats out of it. You can look at what's his expected save percentage or something like that. And just get a bit more granular and deeper into goalkeeper numbers. So that's kind of the conclusion of that one. And I mean, FBref is something that we use a lot at the Athletic, something we use a lot on the Zonal Marking podcast as well, which I do with Michael Cox and Ali Maxwell. And that's the site which you can get this kind of data publicly available. And I think that StatsBomb's goalkeeper kind of, or their shots on target model is probably the best on the market, just because it's got the most granular info. And then, of course, another part of my job is not just explaining this stuff, but trying to visualize it as well and make it look appealing. So this is my kind of 538-esque style guides, the brand look. And this was the data for 2019-20. So Vicente Gaeta at Palace was the best keeper in terms of prevented most goals versus what you'd expect. Even though I think, Alisson had the highest save percentage. And by that model, he was just below par, or I guess above par as it should be. But this one's really interesting because then you jump up from here and you look at Gaeta last season, you look at him this season. I think this season he's like bottom of the table. And again, that kind of springs to mind another question, which is another article, which is what's wrong with goalkeepers? Like, performance is so noisy with them. Is that because of the stats? We're looking at the wrong ones? Is that just the nature of the position? Something like that. So that's the first. The second is probably the biggest bugbear, which you see, which is always kind of like, distance run and the kind of lazy factoid you get of, thrown up on a Champions League night and a player gets subbed off and he's like clapping himself off and it's like 14K run. Everyone's like, yeah, fair enough. 14K, really, really good. Best player on the pitch, which, that's not the case. So I just think that was a nice example of kind of questioning that and why that isn't the case. Like, why running the most doesn't make you the best player on the pitch. And that set us up nicely for another article I'll mention later, which is around looking at running and running stats in a bit more detail. So I think, unless those numbers are framed properly and you're using them in the context of players in their own position or the same role or something like that, then they don't tell you or not. They're a figure, but I don't think they're an overly interesting nugget of insight, really. And the third, of course, is around possession. And again, another media thing will be, oh, they had 80% possession, and just understanding that possession and control of it is not always indicative of the quality of a side, or at least the quality of creating chances and scoring opportunities, which at the end of the day in football is like what you're playing for. You could have 100% possession and lose the game because you haven't literally attempted to score a goal and risk ceding possession to actually win a match or score a goal. So I think that's one we've come back to again and again. I think there's sometimes, with our writers, we'll dig into, okay, possession for this team has gone up recently. What does that tell us, instead of like they're better now? Because it doesn't always mean that they're better now. I think, Leicester are the side in the article there, I think, that we mentioned, one example of a team who have had less possession when they won the title and use it excellently to their own advantage. There are countless other examples of teams who are winning games without having too much possession. So that for me was just kind of an easy one to check off and kind of bring expected goals into the conversation of a good indicator of the quality of the team, instead of just looking at the kind of possession percentages in the box score. Next is defensive stats, which I think you could probably write a whole piece in and of itself, of kind of the current state of defensive analytics. There was a great piece recently, actually, in the Ringer, looking at basketball analytics and defensive stats in basketball, and how it's like they're still finding it so hard to this day, even with advances in tracking data and metrics and things like that. And again, had Sky Sports News on earlier, not to slam Sky Sports News, they do a lot of stuff, but it's just the data editorial at times. A table of numbers doesn't always tell the right story. Sometimes you need context around that and things like that. And maybe that's because we are kind of a small portion of the market who cares about this stuff and cares about context being key and all this thing. But I just think that at the end of the day, if you're going to do analysis or show some numbers, you want to show the right ones. And so, I think the example here is Ricardo Pereira made the most tackles last season without anything, thought of minutes or, was that the most for a fullback? It probably is. What was if you'd only played half the games? What is if you played all the games, but someone had played slightly fewer games, but on a per 90 basis, like made more tackles? What does it mean to make a lot of tackles? Like, what does that say about your overall game? And things like that. So I think you could, like, I've done it a number of times myself, where I'll be planning for a piece, and our deadlines mostly to get a copy to our editor is 2:00. So I'll be there in the morning, sit down, I've had my coffee, I've had my breakfast, it's 9:00, and I'll be like, right, I'll write this piece. And I'll get about 3 hours in, and I'll just be like arguing with myself in my head, thinking like, I'm getting too far down this kind of theory of what interceptions are and whether they actually exist in practice and things like this, without actually zooming out and thinking, okay, think of it for like an average fan. Like, how do you make this applicable? Why should, the average athletic reader care about what you have to say about tackle stats? Because sometimes it's, it's not that deep, it's just a number. But this one was very much just to say, we could possession adjust these, and my approach is quite an explainable one, and looking at kind of for every 1,000 touches that the opponent makes when the player's on a field of play, how often do they do that action? And I think that Jordan Henderson, as I give an example there, as someone who Liverpool, when they won the title, had a lot of possession. He makes an okay number of tackles on a kind of raw per 90 basis. But when you adjust that for possession, it jumps up a lot more. And it shows that he is an active defender, probably more active, because even though his team have a lot of possession or don't have much time out of possession, when they're out of possession, he's probably more active than some of the guys who have to defend a lot. So that's one example of defensive stats. And I think that, we use Smarter Scout a lot on the site, and they have some really interesting metrics of defending quantity and quality. And the quantity is around kind of trying to guess really like which defender is the most relevant to the ball. Do they have an opportunity to defend? Do they engage if they do have an opportunity? And then there's defending quality, which is one where you look at kind of for the player who's kind of assigned on a given touch, like how often can the team like easily progress the ball forwards or take a shot. So let's say like 5-a-side, if I'm the fullback, no one's getting past me. You constantly see in my zone, if there's a touch of the ball, they're going backwards and sideways. Whereas maybe with David, they see him and they think, "God, take on, key pass, score a goal, whatever." So I think sometimes it's interesting to try and adjust for those things, and that's something that we use on the site, and it's something different to tackles and interceptions. It's obviously quite deep and it's been modelled already, but I think it's still an interesting one. And then true tackle win rate is one where it was a bugbear of mine at Opta, where you see kind of like tackle win percentage. A guy will have a tackle and he's won it, but the definition of a tackle won, a tackle lost in event data isn't really what you think it might be. So I think in Opta, a tackle won is you make a tackle and you win possession, and a tackle lost is you make a tackle but you don't win possession. So if Aaron Wan-Bissaka slides in the touchline and concedes a throw-in, he's still getting a round of applause from the fans. He's still made the tackle, but he's not given away a foul. He's not been shrugged off. He's not completely slid past the guy in possession and made a fool out of himself. So he's still technically like won it in the eyes of I guess an analyst at times. And this one really is to adjust for that and look at, do you cleanly win tackles, or are you like Andre Gomez or Fred, who kind of consistently get, they're like, look at Andre Gomez, you're an amazingly good looking man, but you can't get this ball off me, and kind of push him away. Fred, you see a lot of the times he'll be kind of scurrying after the ball and he's going in for 50-50s, but his height, his strength, some of the other players can easily kind of knock it around him, and he might win some of his tackles, but I don't think the denominator is quite right for that stat. So if you adjust for that, you see that he might drop down the list, and it shows that there are times when he's trying to win the ball back, but he's not very efficient at doing so. Next is XG and finishing, which we could probably do a whole hour and a half just on that, whether finishing skill exists or not in and of itself. So this one was just, Firmino is a great example of someone who everyone will look at and say he's a terrible finisher, and I think this kind of shows the noise in goals and XG, and the debate in 17-18 might have been, God, Firmino's one of the best finishers in the Premier League. And 18-19, it's like, oh, he's not as good as last year. Like he must be upset, or he must be injured, or or however else you can spin that into a narrative. And then 19-20 will be, Firmino is an awful finisher. They need to sell him and get someone else. And maybe I don't think that's the whole story. And I'm always intrigued by that kind of XG debate. So we tend to look at maybe a larger number of shots and of chances, and I really don't think that's the most correct way to kind of model this situation. And there are other approaches again we can get into, but the one that I said here was looking at expected goals on target, maybe to see if a guy routinely kind of looks to put his shots in the corners and makes it difficult for the keeper to save these shots, instead of just looking at XG and goals. But yeah, I'm kind of not sure what the current state of the union is on kind of finishing skill. There's been some really nice recent papers at the Opta Pro Forum, and it's one that kind of crops up again from time to time. Again, I'll name drop Smarter Scout, and I think Stats Perform have done some interesting work where you kind of model the shooter and the goalkeeper separately, and kind of take that as a duel between each one, and look at kind of, if you adjust for the baseline of the XG of the chance, who wins the duel? Okay, the finisher won it this time, he gets some credit, and then you treat every scoring and saving opportunity as a duel and see who consistently wins their duels. And that's what Smart Scout's model does, and I think that's what Stats Perform roughly looks to do as well. I don't know if you guys had any questions up to this point.
Yeah, I've got press the mute. Yeah, I have quite a few actually. Or what I wanted to actually do is give you a few from the chat, because there's some really good ones. So Anna Rug asked a couple of questions, but I'm going to take the second one of this. Is how do we identify and set aside our own biases when it comes to players and teams we like? So how do we avoid subconsciously manipulating the stats? And I think I put that in a context of something that I'm very familiar with, is the coach who wants the stats to support how well they did or why they failed based on his or her own analysis. And I can just imagine the editor asking you the similar question.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of fortunate that like I work in football, not at a club, but my analog is, I've said it a few times before, I think that my coach or my scout is the writer or the editor. You know, these are kind of my people that I interact with, and I'm kind of the gatekeeper to stats a little bit, but more kind of like want to push them towards best practice and things like that. So yeah, there will be situations where, I mean, I'll answer this one first and go back to the original question, where a writer will say, you know, well, I don't think, you know, X striker, I'm not going to drop anyone's name in there, you know, X striker isn't playing too well at the moment. Like, what do the stats say? And you get to the numbers and you go, well, you know, looking at the data, these are the conclusions I pulled out, and send some bullet points to have a phone call, however it works. And they go, oh, okay, yeah, that's not what I expected, so I'd probably leave it. And you're like, well, no, come on, wait, because surely this is more interesting. You know, trying to bust that myth is arguably more interesting than looking for, you know, supporting evidence and you know, allowing confirmation bias to happen. And arguably it's better journalism, and also that's the point of data journalism, is probably saying you think this, but actually the numbers say this. Let's have a conversation about it. So I guess sometimes it's just trying to like approach that, and you don't always win the battle, and they go a different direction, but you know, case by case, I think we're probably a net positive in terms of like, okay, someone thinks this, we think differently. Maybe let's write an article and say, you know what, actually you think otherwise. And that's probably why the Athletic is doing so well, because how many other, you know, outlets would kind of challenge that and be able to use data or get access to, you know, whatever the approach to answering that question. But I think that's like healthy journalism, healthy debate, really. But in terms of like my own personal biases, like I probably have learned, because I'm so close to different writers and I work across a lot of different teams. I mean, my own personal bias towards Arsenal, the team I support, like went so many years ago, because I think that as soon as you get into this side of the sport, like the kind of emotive fan in you dies a little bit. Because you're like, you know, you come into the season, you're like, this could be our year, and you're like, yeah, this could be the year we finish ninth, and you know, not actually as good as we think we might be. So I think like the nature of I guess the person I am, I kind of try and keep my biases in check a little bit, and also some of their kind of pro team biases have long gone. But I think otherwise, like, you're close enough to all of the different writers, you're close enough to the teams, you watch enough of the different teams that like and also close enough to the numbers that I don't know, I just feel so well informed for all the different teams that like if I have a bias or a gut feeling with something, I have the tools in which I can go and check if Villa are attacking a lot better this year, or if, you know, if I haven't really like adjusted my prior of Man City's defense being really good, I can update that quickly by looking at video or talk to the writer who's watched them every week, who arguably is like the most informed person that you can have in that situation. So yeah, I think we probably do quite well to keep those sorts of biases in check. But I think the more interesting thing at the moment, and I'm reading Daniel Kahneman's Noise currently, and it's like some of the stuff, again, it's so obvious, but sometimes the most obvious ideas are the ones that like are the proper light bulb moment, because everyone can understand them and you can relate to them. And I think it's probably kind of the noise about how we react to certain situations, or the noise of like this situation with, say, Liverpool has happened. How do you analyze and think about that? And I think a lot about like what is my consistency of like what data I'd use or what route I'd use to answer that question, and whether I am just like changing my process at times because I've come from the question from a different angle, or if I'm using the same stats for the same question for every single team. Or like, let's say, you know, for one writer, they respond really well to like certain types of data or certain types of visuals, and to others it's different. But you know, is one actually better than the other and results in a better analysis or a better like piece at the end of it, and it's more interesting for the reader. Yeah, I think that the noise thing, as well as kind of like keeping your biases in check, is interesting. And I'm still kind of figuring a lot of that out.
The noise thing was fascinating when, I mean, I'm a Liverpool fan and I was very happy they won the league, but there was also this whole thing that analytics won Liverpool the league, which even their chief analyst would not agree with by any. In fact, he would be very resistant to saying anything of that type. But it was very, I don't know if the Athletic ran that article too, but it was is interesting, that type of thing, that you become biased in that way as well, because it's very convenient to have that story that the analytics help them to such a large degree, because it really supports what you're trying to claim, I think. Yeah,
I think the one that I probably struggle with a lot is putting, and David, you've written a great piece about this, and Ben Torbeney's done a recent piece on this as well, about kind of like really how much stock do you put in XG? Because for like XG for us really is like the poster boy, poster girl stat that like we are like, this is analytics and this is like the gateway for you. And if you get it and you understand it and you find it useful, like welcome to the club. There's a lot more where that came from. But then there's certain situations where you're like, okay, well, XG maybe isn't the stat and goals are better, or a mix of the two, or like another metric is better. But at times I've probably been guilty of like vehemently sticking to XG and be like, no, like this, you know, this is the right tool to use. It's like, yeah, we know XG is good and we know that it's helpful. And we know that it's like, you know, it shows the value of analytics, the value of using data. But there are probably like other simpler numbers at times that are better, or like other approaches to answering certain questions. So it's probably just like not being, I don't know, being open-minded enough to like just saying, yeah, you can put XG down sometimes and just look at goals or look at these other stats because they arguably tell a better story. We're not forgetting about the value of that metric. We're not forgetting that, you know, XG isn't useful, but there's more to this whole space than that one stat, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There are loads of other questions here. Let me just get in one before then I'll let you finish your other 4 commandments or whatever's left. Do you think there's a quality, Vinny asks, do you think there's a quality quantity trade-off when it comes to football analytics? There's many vises out there and often they hardly warrant any conclusions. What do you think about that? Where's your position on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a quantity quality trade-off, but I do think part of that is like, analysts are on, or like people, we say analysts, you know, the people on Twitter putting out this work on different journeys, right? Like some people will be very much at the cutting edge, like ready for a club job or an industry job or something, and they've been doing this for years. So they're kind of like hours spent and quality of work graphic, they're probably like top corner. They've made like 1,000 graphics, they've seen 10,000 graphics, and they know how this stuff works. They've been through the mill. And then you'll have the guys who are just starting out. So, you know, the hours are low, the quality of the work is low, or, you know, no disrespect, but that's just the case because they've not made those mistakes and made those lessons and got to the end of the person who's been in it for ages. And I just think that, yeah, on Twitter, you'll see a large, I guess, range of different quality of pieces of work. But I do think there's a bit of groupthink in terms of like, we see a scatter plot of certain things and people go, yeah, that's really nice, and make the same scatter plot or make a similar one. And I think sometimes people just like making graphics and making pretty things and don't care too much about the analysis, which is completely fine because I've been guilty of that myself. Like I remember years ago, I was making, I don't know what the graphic would have been. I think it was like a kind of waffle chart. And each of the squares was like a unit of possession, like a possession chain for a team. And I would like spend my Sunday, I'd gone to this cafe and I was like, I had nothing else on. I had no plans. I was probably a bit hungover and just thought, I'm just going to make this graphic. And I was spending that ages like learning this new like ggplot package and building it all together and theming it and like really heavily like annotated it and everything and put it on Twitter. And I was like, you know, I've just done a thing. Like everyone look at the thing I've just built. And I think like one of the first comments was probably from like an analytics community veteran to be like, yeah, great, but what does it tell us? And you're just like, well, it doesn't, well, it looks nice though, doesn't it? And like, I think sometimes like people just like building stuff and like,
yeah,
they enjoy creating things. I think that's fine. But I think if you're aiming to be like a, you know, an actual analyst, I just think there's more conciseness needed, get your conclusions across, use annotations, be original in the work that you're doing. And there's always this thing on Twitter of kind of like plagiarizing of data viz, which is a weird topic because I mean we're making graphs on the internet. It's not like we're trying to sell it for anything. It's nice to be credited at times, but I don't lose any sleep if someone's copied a graphic design and not given credit. But yeah, I think of course
you've copied about 3 or 4 of mine. So
yeah, exactly. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants.
You did send me the GG plot of Pep's pitch to start off with. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think you said something that's really kind of important, and maybe for people who are kind of wanting to get into this is exactly what you just said is, and I will first also say, like, as a mathematician, I get very into making like the pictures in my papers sometimes, and sometimes I even think that I do particular kinds of math because I like the pictures that I can create in my head involving them. I'm very much in, but I think you had a key point, which was the thing, because you have to do this anytime you're communicating, is like, what is the point of what I'm saying? It like, what is the person who's looking at this or reading this or sitting in a classroom or in a seminar talk, which is where I'm most familiar with it, but you two both do the writing thing, and so you're the other side of it. But yeah, whatever you're producing, what is the person who's looking at it getting out of it? Are you communicating something, and is it what you want to communicate?
I just remember this one, and I was thinking about these early days when Tom was on Twitter. I fitted expected goals models for teams over a 10 matches. So it gave a very bad fit, but it made these sort of bubbles that went round, which was the probability of scoring. And I just put all of these up on Twitter with a pink, black kind of background, and everybody, I mean, first of all, I got all of these grumpy people telling me, well, you can't do a fitting like this, and I was really just doing it for fun, but also it looked like body parts in various positions and so on. And so that, I was thinking when you said how people read into these things, and I think it's really difficult because the reasons people put things on Twitter are very different. Sometimes they're just having fun, sometimes this is the most serious thing they've ever done, but how people interpret it can vary a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it comes to the medium, right? Like, we've got 280 characters to try and cram in everything, and that it's not perfect.
Hopefully on the Athletic you make some sort of take care to put.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the other side of the Athletic is perhaps sometimes it's too verbose and there's too much, which is the kind of common complaint you get. But that's the product; it's long form football writing. So I'll jump back to the
please do.
The commandments.
Well, while you're putting that up, there was one thing I wanted to say, though, because I say this also to my students and so on, which is that people's eyes are drawn to things that are aesthetically pleasing, though. And so in having given research talks, the number of times that I was told, oh, that's a beautiful talk, like it always corresponded with how nice my slides looked. So if you want to like draw people's eyes into something, I mean, there's both levels of it. One of which is it should be aesthetically like alluring, which I think everybody who's good at data viz probably knows. Anyway.
I mean, I know some club analysts who definitely like prioritize just the like raw insight side of things over like things looking nice. So like we'll compare ideas and compare notes and stuff, and they'll send a graphic. And I'll send one back, and they'll just be like, oh, yours looks really nice. And I'm like, yeah, but if yours works and it gets the point across, it arguably doesn't matter. Arguably, if you're a football analytics writer and you're trying to build a brand and have a following and stuff, you wouldn't be able to put out stuff that doesn't look good because it just wouldn't get the following, I guess. But anyway, back to the commandment. So the seventh one is thou shalt not judge a team's performance with or without a given player. So again, this is kind of mainly probably looking at like the with or without you stats that are probably more prevalent in basketball and smaller sided games, probably ice hockey as well. And then being translated over to football and saying, okay, well, Jordan Henderson for Liverpool in 1920, with him, they were so much better than without him. And there are so many factors that go into this. And I mean, the most basic models, none of this is controlled, right? So it's the conclusions you get can be completely spurious. Now, there are some more advanced approaches, which I think are interesting that hold for this. And I think 21st Club have a fairly advanced model. David, I imagine you've touched this kind of work at some point because I think it's an interesting research question. And there are various other approaches. I mean, the late Gary Gillard, who a lot of his work has kind of inspired a lot of analysts, he had a recent-ish blog post in 2019 where he kind of revisited this and was kind of like, am I wrong? Like, are we wrong in our way of kind of approaching this?
We have a Friends of Tracking video all about it. If you want to look that one up.
Yeah, I think I can't remember the other chap that he spoke about with it, but that was, I remember that one. It was great. One of my favorites so far. But yeah, and it's always, I mean, from my kind of athletic hat on, it's always an interesting one where the writer will ask for those numbers and say like, are they better with or without this player or something like that. And I arguably think the more interesting thing is like, what are the reasons why that would be the case? So I think one recently is Granit Xhaka being linked to Roma, and with or without you could look at the stats and it could say he's better, could say it's worse, whatever. But I think the more interesting thing is like tactically, and technically, what do Arsenal lose when he's not there versus if you play El Neni? And El Neni is like a ball retention king. Like, he's incredible at going sideways and backwards and keeping possession, but you rarely move the ball forward. Whereas with Xhaka, he might be a bit more risky. He might be a bit more, aggressive out of possession at times. And again, that's the thing that might be a bias, might not be real. But he's great at moving the ball forward. So, you could have El Neni plays on games where Arsenal are dominating and he's in Europa League and he's in against bottom half of the league kind of quality sides, and his with or without you numbers could look far better than Xhaka's, but tactically Xhaka offers a lot. So I think there's a case that those numbers work really well for certain positions. Now I think centre backs, it can work quite well. As one example, an analyst was talking about recently with me where one of their centre backs was out and the replacement one came in, and what had happened is the ball had come to him and he didn't get a shout from one player, and he was like pressed, or a passing angle was closed down, or something happened, and then a few seconds later the team had lost the ball, and then it created a goal scoring opportunity which didn't go through to score. But it's that situation where you're like, okay, the other centre back, if he was there, maybe would have shouted to that guy and said man on, but he wasn't used to doing it, and that whole relationship wasn't there on the pitch. Now that's like a really granular specific example, but that's where you can see why certain partnerships, and with or without even partnerships, might be an interesting thing to look at. The eighth one is passing accuracy. So, thou shalt not judge a player's passing ability on his passing accuracy. This was an interesting one again, because I got to make a nice looking, if it still works, video. Now, of course, we can't use video because of the rights issue, so we try and get around it with stills at times, but also with, I tried a GIF and we didn't get sued or closed down, so obviously it worked. But this was an example where I think there was a ball from Helder Costa into the box. The pass was marked as incomplete, but the ball goes out for, I think, a corner for Leeds. I think they're playing Wolves in this game. And that to me was interesting because it's like an incomplete pass, and it's kind of flirting with the idea of expected threat or possession value or pitch control or whatever kind of tier of those non-shot XG metrics. It's kind of thinking of the game in those terms and trying to bring the reader into that kind of realm, that kind of gateway of sorts. And I think a lot of time, we talk about pass completion rate, or pass completion rate is spoken about, and it doesn't quantify or doesn't care about this quality element. What are you adding? What's the value you're adding? So I think that's the kind of thing I was trying to speak about there, and saying, like, we'll write more of it in the future, which I did, but expected pass completion rates can tell you more about probably, choices of passes, or what they try to do in possession versus execution. This was obviously me struggling at this point to think of many more, but also one that I think my editor had probably called out and said, I think it was Sebastian Haller at West Ham, and he won the most aerial duels, but also lost the most aerial duels at one point last season, which again is interesting because it just shows you he's going up for a lot of aerial duels, which tells you something about West Ham's strategy and how they were using him. And again, Trent Alexander-Arnold's most unsuccessful passes, again flirting with the idea of this risk-reward trade-off that any player in possession has, and saying that you care more about the context and adding a percentage, or what are they trying to achieve with things like that. And then the last one, arguably, is the most simple, and one of the first ones you do, again, if you're looking at or even thinking about football numbers for the first time, but players who play less can actually look better than those who have played more, just because they've had less opportunities to do certain things on the pitch. So Buendia, excellent chance creator. He's been consistently a great player season on season. And then you've got like De Bruyne as well, who you look at total chances this year, he won't be up there because he had a fairly sustained layoff in terms of injuries, but he came back. I mean, I think he won PFA Player of the Year. He was his same self pretty much. But because he's played less, he's not had an opportunity to do that. Now, I think that's such a basic one, an obvious one, and arguably you should always per 90 adjust these things, maybe not goals and not assists, because I mean, those are kind of the untouchables at times. But chances created and things like that, passes per 90, whatever kind of counting metric, I think it makes sense to per 90 it, or do what I think Gary did, which is kind of look at it per 100 touches, and like per 100 attacking touches, and look at the frequency of events, and not just something that's probably biased by minutes played.
I think I'm really interested now, because I've been thinking during your talk and just what you said there at point 8. So the thing which I sell the most is whether this action increases the probability of the team scoring, your team scoring, or decreases the opponent's. And so and that's what we've talked about loads of times here. And we had a big thing on it last week where we were putting in tracking data into it as well. And the modeling is really cool and interesting, very nice mathematical stuff. And then and I also, and this is where I'm kind of selling this all the time, is I think it's a very simple concept to understand. This action increased your team's probability of scoring. And why do you think that hasn't really sort of taken off in the same way as expected goals has taken off as a way of measuring football? Or do you think we're just on our journey there? Or what's your reflections on that?
I think we're on our journey there. I think the simplest answer is probably the most boring, is that like the reason XG probably took off as it did is because it was supplied by a data supplier, let's say, Opta. And during my time there, I spoke to a lot of media of clubs, and there was probably an element of like, we helped to literally put it into a feed, into an API to send off to clients to use. And that is the barrier down, because then you can access it and you can stick it in tools and you stick it in feeds, and Sky Sports can send it to their graphics provider and they can stick it in a nice table and it can get on telly. That's, and once you've done that and people see it, then it kind of snowballs from there. So I think the issue with these kind of suite of metrics is that there's not a single one. Like with XG, there's kind of one metric, and you could use a logistic regression, you could use a neural net, whatever you use, but the kind of approach is the same, right? You have the same outcome, the same kind of target and all these things. Whereas with this, like, we don't really have like a standardized possession value metric at the moment. And it's kind of, Stats are making theirs and Opta have theirs. But the biggest issue is it's not been put in the feed. It's not been sent to clients. It's not been, there's the accessibility of those metrics isn't there. And I think that's why you see a lot of people on Twitter making their own like bootleg versions, and people are taking, the thing now isn't like getting access to who scored data. It's like, okay, who's got an expected threat grid that I can like use, and like who you DMing to like get access to that to apply it yourself. So it'll come because I think it just depends on the suppliers getting that productized and getting out to partners and clubs and people like that. And it's the boring answer, but I think it's probably the right one. Because I think the example I always go back to is like, as a kid, you'll watch a game and there are certain moments in the game that happen, which aren't a goal, which aren't a save, which like middle of the pitch and something's happened and a pass will be completed or an action will take place and the crowd will clap and they will recognize that something good has happened. And that is what this model is looking to measure. It's looking to measure those bits that you as a fan go, yes, that was a great bit of play. But at the moment, the stats just say completed pass, like 4 yards to the left, right? And it's giving it more value than just like a count. And that's like the sell. The sell is like, it's going to pick up the things that you yourself see and you think are useful. I don't think selling it is the issue in terms of like the idea. I think the issue is just like access at the moment.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So, but I'm also, because this is we're never gonna. I feel like I'm a little worried we're not gonna get to the paper that I'm like or articles I'm most interested in. But there's something that's been coming up in this also, which is part of my thing, which is that like soccer's actually is like there's a system of players, and most of the stats just so much focus on who's on the ball and the very immediate things and so on. And I like that you kind of shifted over in, now I have to remember because I read it exactly the same time, 2 articles, so I'm going to get them blended in my mind. I was reading the one on passes and crosses at the same time, but you did something in there with like, well, what happens within 6 seconds after that pass also.
I can show that one now while you're explaining.
Yeah, well, and also, because there's several interesting things in these too. Yeah, because there's also, you talk a little bit about something which is something that I kind of both observed, and I had been working on, or it was one of the ideas that came up and stuff when I was talking with students, and we haven't kind of come back to it yet, but now I really want to, which is basically, as you said, a lot of stuff happens out of chaos. In some sense, like a lot of goals are really scored in the chaos right after, like, somebody shoots and then and it's rebounded, and then there's a scramble and it goes in. But in some sense there was, and I can't remember, somewhere in here you're talking about sometimes even if something isn't completed, it creates the chaos that causes, you don't want the other team to be strictly organized. Like if you're trying to get through them, you don't want them to be at their best and strictly organized. You want them to be scrambling to handle a situation or trying to transition into, attacking. And so, yeah, I was kind of curious as to your thoughts and where this was coming up and so on.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my initial thoughts on kind of, just because the data supply says something's like incomplete in the model of the game or the way you watch, like incomplete doesn't always equal bad or wrong. Like I think there are the number of times I think of the cross that's blocked that's like technically incomplete, but the player would have never completed it anyway because the defender was right in front of him, and he goes out for a corner, and it's like, yeah, it's an incomplete cross, but like he's still made the right decision in that situation to kind of take the corner, or the kind of like long ball from deep. And this was my like longest standing bugbear. It's so irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, but like ball down the line from the fullback that's kind of like arching down, and you see the other fullback coming over, and again it's just this model of like, will the fans clap? Yes, okay, that's a good thing, because you see the ball go down the line, the pass will get intercepted by like the fullback, and the team will run a throw like 50-60 yards downfield, and everyone recognizes that initial pass was like a very, very good one because you've gained like territory, and a lot of it. But in the data it's just like incomplete pass, number 2 left back, bad decision, or like, poor execution or whatever. But it's not, because you've gained all that distance. And I think that's why there's a lot of value in the kind of possession value, XT, all these kind of suite of metrics, because certain things like that will now get far more credit than just incomplete 0 of 1 attempts or something like that. But to come back to this part around kind of the chaos, again, there are just no new ideas really in this space, and this was something that I remember Gary Gillard presented at an OptiPro forum years ago about crossing and his approach. And I kind of looked at his, and I think he used a decision tree and he modeled it on the start and end locations of passes. And his example was I think it's like the all-time most popular Kaggle data set of like Titanic survivors. And that seems to be like any Coursera or like data science 101 course, like you will at some point like see that as an example. And Gary really just applied that to like crossing. Like, is the cross from deep? Yes. Okay. Was it blah, blah, blah. And then it gets to the bottom. You're like, okay, cross from deep with these characteristics will result in a goal 2% of the time. And that was an interesting approach. But I think that his major innovation there, which is in the small print, is that he looked at goals scored over a 6-second window, because it accounts for that kind of chaos or dangerosity or whatever you want to call it from the original cross. And the example I used here was, because I'm a masochist, goals conceded by Arsenal. So you've got Trent Alexander-Arnold's putting the ball in, and Robertson kind of goes in late at the back post. Willian, of course, has lost his man and kind of slots it home. So that's like perfect cross straight to the feet of the man who picks up the ball. Assist for Trent, goal for Robbo. Really kind of like bread and butter football data collection. And then this one here is a cross that's probably a lot deeper from Trent, or at least looks it from the video. And there's no like clear option in the box. There's kind of a late-ish run here from Van Dijk, but he's too far away from holding to really like threaten him. But what we see in from the ball is like a really tame header from David Luiz, and Diogo Jota like is not at all picked up in this situation here. So if you're thinking of the kind of pitch control map, Jota's in like a ton of space, and it's like a nice red patch there for him, and the blue of Arsenal is nowhere really kind of near him. And he picks it up, kind of scuffs the shot. I think he nutmegs 2 players on the way to putting it in the bottom corner, and it like kisses the post and goes in. And that Trent doesn't get an assist because the cross is incomplete, but he's probably done the best he could have done for that situation. Jota's in the right position. He's forced a bad clearance, and he deserves some sort of credit. So this whole article was really to kind of, how do we give crosses or kind of better evaluate crossing with numbers, because I don't think that the numbers are perfect at the moment. And then this is what that does. So this is a table of the guys who've added assists within 6 seconds. So I think in the 3 seasons that this was kind of looked at over, Trent got 12 assists, De Bruyne got 14, but Trent added 7 more from kind of adding assists, as in creating chaos, and contribute to goals within 6 seconds. And De Bruyne only did 1, which I think is interesting, because you could look into like, why is it that players don't pick up on De Bruyne is De Bruyne like too accurate? I think that's probably doesn't make sense, but like, if he connects on every single one, it's down to the scorers instead of Trent, who's like just gambling every time and putting in crosses that look dangerous. Like, I think crossing is really hard to measure, because again, we go back to the pundit of watching and they go, that was a great cross, and I'm looking in the data of like, okay, XY and like end XY, and I've got nothing on velocity or nothing on kind of like trajectory or something like that, which might indicate why it was dangerous. And this is just a proxy for that, really.
Yeah, no, and I do like that also of you can keep on doing the safe thing or in some sense a safe thing, or it goes back to actually something David kind of brought up in an earlier episode about, because I get really annoyed with the like passing back to the goalie, because like it kind of looks safe, but if you screw it up, you're in trouble. And also it slows things down and all these kinds of things. And David was saying that there's like, what was it that it's actually the chances of, you're messing up a pass resulting in the other team scoring a goal was somehow similar at all levels of the field.
Exactly. So over the entire pitch, the probability of the opponent scoring when you play a cross from one place to the other is pretty much constant, because if you play it up into the opposition's half and you're attacking, then okay, they might get the ball a lot, but they can't score from there. Yeah. And if you pass it on your own side of the pitch, it's actually safer in that way. So there's a sort of, I like this idea a lot as a sort of game theoretic thing, that these things are safe. So there's no risk at all, really, for Trent putting all of those balls into the opponent's box in terms of the opposition scoring.
And I thought that was interesting, because then, I mean, there's the two sides of it, but now we're getting the flip side of it. So that one, it's like, you just keep on passing back in a pass that like most of the time you're going to make that, so it's going to look accurate, even though it has more danger. But then there's the opposite one, which is that if you're never making a pass which is going to lead to a goal, then does it matter if you make all those passes? Like,
I think there's the kind of hypothetical game of football that you sometimes play where you're like, okay, well, the team has 100% of the ball, and this is why kind of like dispelling possession as being king is it dispels that myth, because if you don't turn the ball over and attempt to score and like even slightly cede possession for that one action, like you can't win the game unless you like are completely perfect and at the 93rd plus 24 seconds run the ball into the net. Like it's impossible to win a game and have 100% possession. So you need to kind of like, everything is kind of risk reward really in that sense. For sure. But I guess to kind of finish this one off, we were speaking earlier about kind of like making things pretty, and I spent far too much time to my editor when I was saying I was writing copy, when I was kind of refining these, because these
like the output of it though, just to, you could say it's like,
it worked.
I like the output, whether or not they think it was worth the time. I think it was anyway. Go on.
Absolutely. I mean, and like these are, so this is what came out in like the different zones, and this was something that I mainly got from kind of clustering the different cross start locations together. Because if you look at end location, there are issues with like where the cross goes to is different to where they wanted it to go to. And again, I can put in like a fantastic cross that goes through the 6-yard box but ends up at the corner flag, and all the data will say is like, from where you were to corner flag, terrible cross. So these are like the zones, and you can look at the proportion of times that crosses directly become goals, or the cross becomes an assist, or becomes an assist kind of within 6 seconds. And then I also look through the I think different player ones. So Aubameyang was someone who is a bad crosser, and again, you could probably validate this by looking at the video, looking at technique, looking at and probably try and fill in the gaps that event data doesn't give you. So who's he crossing to? Like if you cross it to Lacazette, I don't think he's that strong in the air. Is he crossing into a box of a lot of defenders to kind of know attackers? Like there's probably supplementary info in here which would shift up or down his expected assists from crosses by this kind of new model. And then guys like, I think Trent was in there as well, as someone who, I mean, this is a really nice one just from the eye test. Like you can, in your mind, you have kind of a heuristic. If I say Trent Alexander-Arnold crossing, you probably think of something like this or something from the half space. So it was kind of fun in our Slack channel to be like, okay, let's think of this crossing group here. Like who is the player who makes crosses from that position? I can't remember if it's in the piece or I put it out after, but trying to see like if people's ideas of who the most common crosser from a zone is aligns with the data. And again, it comes back to, bias of you might have remembered one really good cross from one player in a certain area, and that colors your whole perception of who does that cross a lot from that zone.
Interesting. Yeah, that's nice.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question from the chat because Ewan Harris was wondering if you manually define those buckets or if you got them out of some clustering method. So I thought it would be quite interesting to give a few technical thoughts about this.
Yeah, so I mean, I went down my first approach with this, long before I did the article, was I asked quite a few kind of coaches and scouts kind of, how do you define zones in your head? And there was kind of no correlation between any of them of like what a zone looks like. So it's okay, I'd rather go from the data in this one because you're not going to please anyone. Mm-hmm. So I used a clustering analysis and did some, looked at the elbow and k-means and all fairly basic stuff. But I think what came out of it largely makes sense. And I know a couple of kind of analysts who've done this for their respective organizations. I've done a similar sort of analysis, and this is kind of how they've come up with it as well. So I was kind of confirmed in myself that was a good approach. So I think if you do handcrafted ones, like, again, it probably doesn't make as interesting an article, and it's a good excuse for me really to flex my data science muscles a bit that have probably atrophied in recent years at times.
I'll let you ask some more about this, and then there was one thing I'm very curious to ask about the this was the crossing one, right? Or was this the passing one? Anyway, I have a question I really wanted to ask about the passing one, but I'll let David ask some more about it.
No, I'm finished. I was okay. I think we can.
So
the passing one is the Manchester City.
Yeah.
Well, but one of the most interesting things, of course, I like it because I've been following Manchester City. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was because when you're talking about the passes by the goalie, exactly, by Ederson, and because I feel like passes by the goalie, so like in multiple ways, it showed up in like the semifinal and the final as key. I mean, like in the final, basically the best opportunities out of both teams came from passes from the goalie. And so I was a little bit interested in, and actually part of why they may be more reward, because you're looking at it and you're like, wow, they really don't make that many of the long passes. But if they do, it's such high reward because they're way above everybody. Yeah. But I was curious as to, after, I'm sure you watched the semifinal and the final, your feelings now about kind of goalie passes and how,
Yeah, I guess it hadn't changed too much. Like my approach would probably always be the same. Again, we come back to this whole thing of like threats and value of a certain pass. And I think we could probably even agree, like, if you complete one of these passes straight into the opposition area or deep in the final third, it's probably got more value than kind of completing a pass here inside your own area. And also the cost of like not completing one of these is far lower than it is around here. So I think that's an interesting element of, again, like to add more to the analysis. That's what I'd probably add. But I think my biggest thing with this kind of passing piece and looking at pass clusters is it really colors the way that you watch the games when you've seen these graphics. Now, whenever I watch City now, it's kind of the Leonardo DiCaprio meme from I can't remember the name of the film, but it's kind of him like putting himself on the screen, and like that is very much like me when I'm looking at these pass groups and I see Raheem Sterling receive a pass that in the data is like his most common reception. You're like, I knew that was coming. Like I've seen that. I know that's like, it doesn't go down too well in a household of two other lads when you're yelling like, yeah, pass group 24, seen it. But it's like an interesting insight where I don't know, passes can tell a lot of stories, and they're the most I think I call them like the lifeblood of any football match, because they're the most common action, and they probably just get like everyone's falling over shots and goals and XG and all these things, and yet passing is like the thing that runs a football match. It is the pulse of a game, really. And to me, this was like one interesting way of kind of slicing that and looking at, how do players pass? Is their passing consistent? Has their passing changed? And again, it's something I think analysts use to kind of say, okay, this is how X team, our opponent, passes recently. Is that changed of late? Why is that? And it just helps create questions for the analysts to then kind of supply the coaches with some answers for.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's very interesting with City is that there's nothing really you can do to stop it. So you can, they're the most nicely clustered team in terms of passes and everything. Everything looks very beautiful. But what can you do about it? Even though it's easy to analyze, what's the solution?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, I think the interesting approach to that one is like looking at the losses, right? Like if I'm an analyst in the club, that's probably where you probably start. Like what are the games that they've had 11 men for the whole game, because that's obviously a big factor, and they've not created anything, or they've struggled with scoring goals, or they've conceded a lot of chances. And I think that is probably the way you find that answer, really. But I mean, you can't really look too far away from the Champions League final against Chelsea. But then again,
it's so funny, I'm making a statement from an entirely statistical perspective, ignoring the fact that they didn't win the Champions League final.
Yeah, exactly. But then the issue with that one is that this current Chelsea side have the inner workings of a team that could win the Premier League next year when you look at their numbers. So you're like, okay, the way you beat Man City is to be better than Man City. It's like, well, yeah, but that's not possible for Burnley or like Brighton, or Brighton beat them. But it's an interesting one. And again, like writers will come to us with questions at times of wanting to go deeper. And I think Sam Lee, who's our City writer, one time kind of said, what's happened with City, and this is when the slump was happening at the start of the season. And I went away and got the numbers of like, XG's down, blah, blah. And he goes, yeah, but like, why? And I think that was a really interesting moment of like, we don't have the tools, or like they're not easily accessible straight away without building certain things to like think about why certain things have changed or what's changed on the pitch. Like, yeah, they're getting less XG, but like why is that the case? Like, what's happened? What's the reason for that? And that for me was really interesting way of like having a framework for answering those questions. So I think that, I mean, it's a fairly underutilized or underthought piece of work, really. But we did some work back at Opta on kind of the phases of play. So take a kind of standard game model of like build up, establish possession in the middle third, looking to kind of progress the ball forwards, creating and then finishing. I think that's kind of the four quadrants of in possession. And then you kind of have transition and set pieces and what you do in those. And I think that is like the best way to analyze the game from a video perspective. And also if you can have some metrics around like, okay, well, we don't actually get the ball into the final third nearly as much as we did before. Okay, that's an interesting thing of like, why XG is down, because you had less opportunity to do so. And then you can zoom in a bit more and be like, okay, we're getting it in there less because, we've got so-and-so playing as a defensive mid and his ability to progress the ball forwards isn't as good. And then you're getting to the building blocks of like the dynamics or, the mechanisms about how a team works. And I think that's really interesting because that's kind of the nexus of tactics and analytics. And you don't need you can get quite a good way away with that with just event data. I think, again, tracking is a lovely layer on top, but I think if you've got some nice phase level metrics, that can help learn a lot about kind of the tactical side of the game as well.
There's an interesting question here on the chat is, do you think there's any possibility in the future of calculating the chance of winning of one team just by comparing their passing patterns and their networks?
That's a really interesting question. I imagine you probably could do so. I wonder if it will just start to learn that like City make passes that other teams don't, and therefore teams that do what City does win games more often. But yeah, I mean, it would be a definitely an interesting one. I think that, I mean, one article I always come back to, and it's relevant to this, is Seth Partnow, who's our basketball analytics writer, wrote a piece about I think it's Goodhart's law or Godhart's law, and that when when a target or when a measure becomes a target, it like doesn't become a good measure anymore, or something. One of those like that. We always say about analytics, the key to that is communication and language and explaining things, and I've done that terribly. But yeah, I think that's an interesting thing where like teams, just because like you pass well, like City, like that's not how you have a good attack, or that's not how you become a good team. It's kind of an indicator of a good team. The same way, in basketball, like taking a lot of 3-point shots doesn't make a good team, because teams will give up good looking 2-pointers to take a really hard 3-pointer. And I think that's probably the same sometimes in football. Of if I said in the crossing piece, cross from this position is like the best place. And if everyone then like trying to like rushes the ball to that position to cross from it, it's no longer a good place to cross from. So I'm always a bit nervous with questions like that, because I'm like, we don't want to break the game. We don't want people all like rushing to do the same thing because it wins more matches, because I just don't think that those things exist really.
I think with the playing like City one, I think, I've actually had some students done an analysis of exactly this thing, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work for teams lower down the league to play like City, because they just won't win. It actually works for them to kick the ball long and run, unfortunately.
Yeah. I was going to say that one thing I was going to say, and then see if I can remember the other one from a while back, when you were saying that you were being masochistic in analyzing why your team, when they messed up. But that's, of course I do exactly the same thing, because it's optimism, because you want to believe that they could have won, and that you just have to figure out what they could have done differently, and then they would have won. But there's also, there is the progression of tactics. It's like, it's once you come up with an idea that works well with how everybody else is playing, the next season, if you try to do exactly the same thing, they're prepared for that. That's not like, it's just kind of cool, which is that like there is this ever evolving.
Yeah, I think that's, so to jump in, I think that's an interesting one of like this whole narrative of times of like teams get found out. I think the most recent example we have is probably Chris Wilder and Sheffield United, of like they had a very distinct tactical approach where they had on rushing fullbacks in a very kind of stodgy midfield, and they used to attack in a certain way, and they got found out in season 2 and they were terrible. But I think even things like that, like you don't need to use fancy data or modeling or even have a great tactical understanding to see that like sometimes the answers are also the most obvious ones. Like when you lose your starting left centre back and your left wing back has to slot in there, and it changes again, we come back to like the dynamics of the team completely changes. They've not been found out, they're just their level is worse. And I think there's probably instances where like being found out is the case, but there are probably others as well where it's like, no, it's not as complicated as that. Like some major component of the team has disappeared, and that is to answer for it instead.
Interesting.
Right. What are we going to do? One more, Catherine, or what's the plan?
Yeah, this is a question. So, okay. Yes. I definitely want to see, there was the other one you wanted to show, and I definitely want to see it. So, but I wanted to make sure that we got into a little bit about talking about these, because I thought they were very interesting and very different from the other things you were talking about. And there was one other thing that I kind of wanted to say before we jump into the last paper that you really wanted to talk about. And so I really want to let you talk about it. Which was, I thought it was interesting also, because you talked about, with passes, a lot of it's also who's receiving, whether like the passes work and so on. And I felt like this also came up a lot in, they're being able to handle a long pass from a goalie, when under pressure and so on. Like, the goalie could do the exact same thing and create the, this beautiful pass and so on. But if the player isn't that quick to think ahead, know exactly who they're passing to, and for there to be somebody for them to pass to, and so like, it's not going to work the same. And so I thought that was interesting that when you were saying that in the passing paper, or maybe it was the crossing one, that it really came into play. You could really see that people would do the exact same thing, and depending on who was receiving it, it would or wouldn't work, So.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, again, that's kind of a fault in the data at times, where certain suppliers will not label who the intended receiver is and others will. And I think obviously when you have that as a data point, you can do some fun things with it. And I think there's certain players where it shows up. I think Ashley Westwood was one who, like, my passing model loved, and he completed tons more passes than expected. But he's literally like lobbing the ball up to absolutely giant, strong men who will pluck anything out of the sky, right? Or like even our definition of like completed is kind of, you know, hits own man first before opposition defender. So it could come off like his head is completely the same as them like bringing it down perfectly and like laying it off to a teammate. I think that is an interesting thing of like, okay, you know, there are probably shades of completion as well. Like a pass can be completed. It could also like graze my thigh and go out for a throw in, and it's still technically like completed. So this is obviously the psyche of someone who spent way too much time with event data and understanding like what the definitions are and like where they're wrong and where they don't marry up with the game. But I think that's another one of which is interesting, because you can take completion rate as something for granted. Like, again, if me and David were playing 5-a-side and I was just like kicking the ball as hard as I can at him and he's getting like pummeled and like and everything's like bouncing off him, but my stats would just say like completed pass, when really like he's got no touch because he can't, because I'm kicking at it really hard from 5 yards away. So yeah,
you're upset with him about something that happened last night.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's low-key accusing me of plagiarizing database. So I'm like, okay, look, I'm gonna have to just kick the ball really hard at him.
Actually, I was actually feeling really bad after I said that to you, because I plagiarized you many more times than you plagiarized me. So, but I do want to think the thing you actually said about Burnley is actually fascinating, because I've talked to Daryl Murray about this, who's the 3-point basketball shooting person, and he's also come out publicly about that he would say that your interpretation is incorrect there. That the correct interpretation is that they're actually onto something with these persistent long balls, and all you need to do is train up players. It shouldn't be the central midfielders who are doing that. It's get the defenders to just lob them up straight away. You run and then run at them as fast as possible with these big long guys. What do you think about that? Do you think? I mean, you think the statistics seem to be saying that.
Yeah, the more thing's interesting, because like part of me is like he's really onto something, and then the other part of me is like, this is a man who's only just seen like very agricultural long ball football like in England. Like I feel that is a fairly standard-ish tactic, but he's probably right. Like I like the way Daryl thinks, and the way that he's thinking, not of like this tactic works, but how do we optimize that? Like what are the things that we can control and we can tweak to win more turnovers in the final third, or like cause more chaos if we go back to this whole thing of chaos. And if you look at, Barnsley signed Daryl DK, who is a unit of a man who, like, I've seen Barnsley live. I saw them at Brentford on back in February, and he came on, I think, in the 60th minute, and he's going up for like 15, 20 aerials. I've not checked the numbers, so it could be completely wrong, but it felt like he was going up for that many at a time. And they've obviously, like, that is a signing where they've seen the skill set, they've seen what he can offer. He fits their game plan perfectly. It helps also that on the ball, he's fantastic, and he will run all day, and he scored some magnificent goals as well. But you can kind of see, that this is a strategy or a tactic which is different and kind of can be done probably on a shoestring budget as well. You can, arguably, we definitely undervalue the likes of Olivier Giroud or other kind of target strikers, because it's probably like not as pleasing as on the eye to kick the ball up to someone and there'd be like a ugly duel or something like that. But if it's effective, like, who cares what it looks like? If it's, football's a results business at the end of the day.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll share the kind of final piece I was going to share.
Yeah.
Which,
should let you do that.
No, I mean, I was going to go for the tracking piece, but I think something which is more pertinent, and if you'll kind of let me plug it, is the
oh yeah, you wanted to show this, go for it.
Yeah, so we've done a piece recently on the Athletic, which is called The Radar, and effectively it's been kind of blood, sweat and tears for a bunch of our kind of writers, and my editor Charlie as well, who's been fantastic throughout, kind of thinking, okay, how do we tackle kind of the way we think about upcoming players in the tournament differently to everyone else? And our approach was, there's a kind of NFL Bible, I guess, called The Beast, which comes out every year, and it's by a guy I think called Dane Bugler, and he will just sit in a room the whole year and collect stats and info and everything on all kind of NFL draft prospects and puts it out in this PDF. And it's like the most popular thing on the site for months. It's very, very interesting. And we thought, how can we kind of port this over to football? So we came up with the radar, which is 60 players at the Euros who we think are, ones that could move this summer, or may move, next summer, or at least are interesting to look out for. And so it's kind of contains data profiles from myself and Mark Carey, who's another data analyst at The Athletic. It's got bios from tons of different writers. It's got a transfer section from the likes of, David Ornstein and our other kind of top quality reporters as well. And it's just something that I guess it's the thing I've probably been most proud of working at The Athletic, and it's probably a good place to plug it. But I just thought, anyone interested in data visualization or thinking about, even designing a report. I mean, this was done in Adobe, but I just think it looks very clean and really nice. And also the content as well. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So, I mean, I'm always listening to kind of Sam Gregory and his lovely hair on the last Friends of Tracking, talking about like reports. And, I think, Catherine, you asked him kind of what does his job entail? And he's like, pre-match report, opposition report, scout report, and reports are like the currency of a data scientist really in a club. And David, I assume you've kind of built something like this as well. And I'm always intrigued by building reports because they just like, we talk about analytics a lot and scatter plots and things you see on Twitter, but really this is probably when it comes to being in a club, like you're building reports at times. You're having a lot of conversations and you're building reports. So I'm kind of open to hearing people's thoughts on it as a template, as things like that, the data used. I just wanted to plug it, look for feedback, and see. Just hope people enjoy it because the Euros kick off tomorrow, and it should be a great month of football.
Well, you've certainly earned being able to plug whatever you want. It looks really interesting. Can I want to do there's a question I've been meaning that, like, for so long, your 6 seconds that you came up with. I kept on meaning to ask this and wondering, so does this pretty much cover most of the inaccuracy in things that happen? So how'd you come up with the 6 seconds, and does it do a good job?
Yeah, so I looked at kind of the distribution of goals that you'd add based on like the length of windows. So if you had like 1 second, you're not getting anything. And if you're adding 10, like you're going to add more than if you had 6. But how much real credit is that to the crosser? So I guess it's a bit of like wet finger in the air and see if it works. And I think it's the same length of time that Gary used as well. And if there's like a better approach to that, I'd be all ears to understanding like how you'd go and measure that. Because mine was pretty much like, is adding another 60% more goals like really fair? Whereas adding, I don't know how, I think we added nearly 50% extra, but it seems like it works. And looking at the video of a lot of chances where it's 0 to 6 seconds instead of 0 to 10, it is like cross in, fail clearance, bit of a scramble, goal. It's not like cross in and then you might have other events in the way, like a pass and another cross, and you're like, well, it's obviously not the original cross which has created this chance. So that is probably one of the more like subjective parts of the analysis where you're like, you could question that, but ignore it because it's probably fine, and everything else kind of makes sense.
No, it is interesting that this is a lot of how you use the tools, or I think we all do this a certain amount where we use the tools for clustering, we use the tools or whatever because it's helpful to give you something to start with. But then you want it to match what your eye says in some sense, like it should make sense. And so there is a certain amount where our eye still has a better sense of something than the data.
Yeah, for sure. And then when like Trent Alexander-Arnold comes on top of like adding more assists, you're like, okay, it's worked. And there's no way that you could kind of like backwards engineer that to just have him on top. Like I just think that you watch him cross, there are certain goals that he's created from his crossing. You're like, okay, it makes sense. I could adjust the window, try and get Matt Ritchie at the top, but then you're like, okay, well, I have bad intentions with this analysis.
Which I asked about earlier, how we avoid that, because there's always a certain amount. Yeah, the players that I'm sure that player's good and that player's not as good. Let's make sure that it.
Yeah, exactly. Just shuffle it around and put them at the top. Yeah.
There's a good question here from Demetrius, and this is also something I've thought about. Is like, could you use number of ball touches instead of seconds? So if the opposition touched the ball twice or 3 times or something, then yeah, basically the cross effect was over.
Yeah, I think that was, I mean, it's something I thought of. I just thought more, you could look at I think the issue with that sometimes is like, what happens if the second ball touch, or like there's 4 in an instance at times when, like within the 6 seconds or something like that. And I just always thought that if you're looking at ball touches, you probably find certain examples or the edge cases where you're like, oh, well, the time between them isn't quite right, and therefore you just keep coming back to time. But I think you could do that for sure. I think you could probably also look at like, does the ball leave a certain radius of which it was crossed into, like the next end location? Does it leave like a certain, 4 meters squared or whatever it might be? Because then you're like, okay, well, he's obviously aiming for something in that area and something has been produced from there. Whereas if it goes out 10 meters and comes back, you're like, well, yeah, it's probably not been the original cross which has helped that out.
It's interesting. Also interesting is that when you're talking about, it's like you think backwards from what was actually the intended outcome, and then how do you measure whether or not they made the intended outcome? I like that. That's kind of, stirring up your thoughts in a little bit if you take just the right twist in the perspective, sometimes you get.
Yeah. I think that's probably informed by like, I mean, a lot of, I don't know, I feel a lot of people who get into analytics and interest in football start like just disbelieving that goals are a thing, and you just purely think in like process and quality of things, and not actually like execution and like intent, and not actually goals that are scored. So it's probably being too aware of outcome bias as a thing, when actually sometimes you should maybe embrace that, because there's value in actually knowing goals are scored more, or knowing that a goal has been scored after a cross and not directly from it. For sure.
True. Okay, so just maybe were there any other questions that you've just been really itching to ask, David?
No, there is actually. I mean, I could continue all night, but I sort of feel that we have to be somehow responsible for Tom's.
This is true. We managed to bring a very, very, very.
He's got the Euros coming up tomorrow, and
I'm off the rest of this week. So if you guys want to go for another 20 minutes, we can certainly do that.
Well, I can actually. I mean, I can continue talking, I think. There's a quote there or there's somebody asking in the thing that they'd like to know loads more about Barnsley and their response. Do you know anything more about the Barnsley situation and how they've worked and so on? Because that's not something we've covered for I think it's a bit embarrassing, but it's not beautiful enough mathematical football for me to be interested in it. But there does seem to be some people who are very interested in this possibility. What have you heard about the Barnsley thing or anything?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for a start, Billy Bean is, I think, an investor or something like that. Billy Bean, of course, of Oakland A's fame, of Moneyball fame. So straight away, there's a direct kind of sports analytics link there. But things to read, like I'd probably say Matt Slater did a great piece about Barnsley's ownership group. And, we're starting to see more and more ownership groups pop up around Europe and around the world, really. And just thinking about like how theirs works and how they're trying to leverage the club they have in France, and I think in Norway and things like that. So that's really interesting. And then John Muller, who is another analytics writer, did a great newsletter about Barnsley, and I think it included the quotes about Darren Morey and the thinking on that sort of thing. So if you're looking to learn more, I think Matt Slater's piece about the building of the group is really interesting from a strategy point of view, and John's from a kind of tactical, analytical is you'll know more than me if you've read both of those in depth.
But if I can, because John contributed so many of the people who we've had, I will say, so probably two of my favorite soccer writers to read are you and John. So
we do need to team up at some point, and do a book or something with fun. But conversation for another day.
And this leads me. So Kayo had a question here. How do you see the market for people like you? Do you see it as growing, or have you got it all covered?
So yeah, probably selfishly the latter. No, it depends. I mean, it depends if we're talking about like, I don't know, in terms of like football data journalism. I mean, it's a bit crappy to say, but I mean, my job is arguably the first of its kind in the UK, and probably still is, in terms of like a large sports newspaper having an analytics writer on staff full time. And now we've got a second because we hired someone in January, Mark Carey, as I said. So I think like going into the job, I very much thought like success for me is, you know, not getting sacked and doing some interesting work and having people enjoy reading it, which is always good. But also like maybe seeing more outlets hiring or looking to do this stuff. Now I think Sky do have kind of data writers, but the way that I feel they have very strict guidelines editorially on like how they can write certain things. So it's never as probably as lucid as my things can get, and arguably like the level of technical skill is different. Like they're using a drag and drop thing to build a bar chart, whereas I'm building it from scratch in R and ggplot. So like it's probably down to the appetite of the publications, right? Like, do they want to have an analytics writer? Like, will the FT go all in and say, look, we want a John Murdoch just for sports, or The Economist or something like that? So there's that angle. And then the flip side, which I was chatting to John Murdoch about this. If you can hear the sound there, that's name dropping. And and John was saying like the biggest issue is the cost of data, right? If you want event data, there's a cost associated with it. And if they want data for, I mean, COVID cases, John can go and get that for free. Like you can find that somewhere. That will get a lot of eyeballs on it. But with football data, there's a cost, and now there's like a fairly big cost. So I'm fortunate that the Athletic like wanted to invest in this and saw this as a growth space, but there's only so far you can get with free data. And I think that at some point you do have to invest in it. So there's probably more scope for like the Premier League's own website to have a full-time analytics writer, or Ligue 1 or MLS have dabbled a bit with some kind of like freelancers. That's probably the next area of growth, rather than the Times going all in and spending, you know, like X thousand on data and people. But it will come. Like I imagine, I mean, all of our journalism is getting more and more like data powered and data informed, and we as consumers kind of are used to it. Our level of data literacy, probably due to COVID, is higher as a population than it was before, right? So I imagine the BBC will go down this at some point, or something like that. So I wouldn't be disheartened. It might take time, but I imagine that, you know, everything is turning to a data these days, and journalism is probably not really not exempt from that.
No, I totally agree. And I think actually, I don't know when the Athletic really looked into the data. I think the data prices are dropping a lot because of the fact there's now 3 companies collecting event data to a very high standard. I think possibly it will become possible for newspapers to buy those sorts of things. I think like 5 years ago, or even 2 or 3 years ago, it was just Opta, who for some reason totally refused to sell their data to anyone, which seems very weird, but that was their policy. But I think that might be changing. Yeah, definitely.
Well, I think sometimes they also make deals with the teams who, you know, they're collecting data for certain teams, and the teams don't want them to be selling the data.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, the teams buy the data, but I don't think they don't want them to sell it necessarily. Well, it depends which data we're talking about now, data and so on. But the event data, they're not so bothered about the selling of that, I don't think. But
I think the issue you probably have is like the thing Opta did, and they probably did quite well for a while, is like it's the same data set, right? Like if I'm selling it to a club, to a bookie, and to a media outlet, like it's the same file, it's the same data, but you know one's got a ton more money to spend on data than the other one, right? So you have to like package it up and sell it at a different price point. And I think people are like, suppliers are still getting to grips with that, and Opta probably have been too low for media at a point. So then you go in and you're like, I can get loads, and now they're realizing that if the media are starting to do stuff that clubs are doing, the price changes more aligns with like what the clubs want. I'm not saying that's happened. I'm just saying like maybe that's the way that the pricing will work. And then you have like StatsBomb, who have been they're like the inverse of Opta, because they've been so pro focused that I guess there's not really a ton of interest in like selling to media. Like they can make more money from clubs because there's so many more clubs, instead of having to like hire an account manager for the media side and like catering just for media. Now that's coming because they're releasing a live product, and I mean, you have to focus on media because there's so much money available there, right? Like if you sell to the Athletic, there's probably different outlets all around the world who will pay for this stuff. So I think that there's probably some kind of pricing things which have to be ironed out. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm intrigued when that happens as well. Like the other side of it is just budgeting. Like if the cost of something else goes up, your gamble on doing more football analytics for a small set of audience will probably be the first thing off the list. Hopefully not with my job. Otherwise, I'll be sending my CV to you, David.
I was, are you jealous of Sam?
Very good question. I'm jealous of it.
I'll just put it directly. What do you think? I mean, going back to would you like to work for a club one day, or is this really your dream job?
I mean, I'm jealous of his tracksuit and his hair and and where he's living. I mean, like one day, yes. Like I've always had the intention of like wanting to work for a club, to have that, have that experience, have that on the CV, and also, I'm kind of like, I guess I'm a bit of a preacher at times for what I do, and the things I write and the things that I build, and the whole kind of brand, awful word, but it's what it is. Like I built for myself. And it would kind of be nice to actually be able to have skin in the game at times and actually, do more than just a consultant gig for a club and be there and kind of, hope to change behaviors and make a club better for the work that I'm doing. So one day, like there's been opportunities in the past that have fallen away for one reason or another. And it will come at some point in the future, I'm sure. It just depends on when. And I just think, I don't know. I kind of want to be able to look back at my career and be like, I accomplished everything I want to. And will the 20-year-old me, if I was to have a conversation with him and be like, yeah, no, I had a really good career. I just never actually tried to work for a club because I was too, risk averse. He'd probably be really angry. So one day we'll see.
That's a great answer.
So because we've been saying that he was like the like that he was dissing on needing to know math or something like this, we should put into context that he's good, like his dad's an econ professor actually at Queen's where I work. So he has like a very, he's from a very academic background. But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to slam on Sam too much, but I had a call with him recently to kind of catch up, and he was showing us his office. And he pulled out his tactics board, and his tactics board had algebra written on it. So I don't know if that's like a cardinal sin.
Comes out.
Sorry, Sam, but it did.
Oh my God! So they were in it. That last Friends of Tracking, they were all in just trying to keep it cool with the maths.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like I never need to do my homework type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna have very angry WhatsApps after this, but that's.
Can I say, that's one thing. Actually, the reason I wanted to, because now we really do have to go, because also my wife doesn't like me shouting after about 9:30. I sent down the dogs to.
Now we're gonna get a dog visit. My dog's asleep.
But I do just wanted to say something about the Lyapunov exponent, because people keep asking me this thing. This 6-second thing that you said that you used,
right? Yeah.
And also, how long can you predict into the future in a football match? There is a thing called the Lyapunov exponent. You can ask Sam about it afterwards, which measures precisely the divergence of trajectories. And I keep saying this to people, that you need to calculate the Lyapunov exponent for football. And I haven't done this myself, but all you have to do is take the difference of where the position of the ball and how it increases over time, and you fit an exponential. You take the logarithm, so you take a straight line, and you can actually find out how quickly different things diverge in football. So that's a project, maybe not for you, but I think that's something that somebody should have actually done.
Yeah, I've always had this idea of, and I've never actioned it because I'm not smart enough, but this idea of, from event data, like you see the dots of where certain things happen. And I've always thought, to a point, those dots, or when you're tracking something, if you imagine we just got like a file of event data and we're going event by event, and when the event happens it pops up on the screen. Now I kind of imagine sometimes that is a bit like a raindrop falling on a pond, because when it drops, the player will move out at a certain radius, like the radius of the area they can move to from that point slowly gets larger and larger and larger over time. And from that, you can probably try and proxy, I mean, there's not enough events arguably, but like where a player will be in that certain zone. And again, it comes to the ball as well, like how quickly the ball can move away from a certain area. So just
that's the diffusion approximation, actually, what you're describing there.
Right.
So you're looking at the diffusion of the thing, and so that has a different scale than the Lyapunov exponent, which goes away exponentially. So it could actually be true that it's a diffusion thing. That's how, for example, in fact, it was Einstein who first looked at this, where you have sort of particles moving around, just jiggling into each other, and you have a random movement. But things in that move quite slowly. They tend to end up where they started. Well, if you had this sort of exponential thing, which is Lyapunov, then things go apart. So my bet is that the football is a chaotic system, and you can measure the time scale of it with the Lyapunov experiment. Something for your students. I keep trying to sell this to people, and no one's done it.
I know. Well, yeah. So I just took on 3 mathematical physics students,
Okay.
and they and I are having an amazing time with this. Our meetings are so much fun. They're this thing. This is great. The questions that I've been giving them and so on. I was thinking about this as you were all saying these things, and that, and part of this was like, if, can you model this behavior like this behaves, or like this behaves, and to what extent, and can you combine them, and can you get the correct thing? And I was thinking, I didn't even think of I am a little obsessed with how water moves. I have been for a long time, and I was like, wouldn't that make me so happy? Like, I would just like it if it were true. Like, not so sure that it is true, but if you could model how a soccer game flowed and so on based on water, this would just like make my aesthetic, like whatever, just the happiest it could possibly be. But yeah, these are interesting. You're right. So I do have I just took on 3 very clever mathematical physics undergrad students working on a bunch of stuff. So yeah, if people and they're having fun. So if there are these ideas, then I might throw more of them at them and see what they come up with.
Nice.
Cool.
Fun.
Great. Well, we better wrap it up,
Yes,
Catherine. We have actually one bonus Friends of Tracking. This was going to be the last one, but we have a bonus one in 2 weeks time, where Maram, now I've forgotten her second name, is going to come on and talk to us about actually clustering.
Revealed it. It's new that she felt comfortable with it. So is it Al-Baharna?
Okay, so Maram is going to come on in 2 weeks' time and talk about her work on visualization, very much so following on from some of the clustering of passes that you were talking about today. She's been doing some really lovely work on that. And so she'll talk on it, because we thought it's very difficult because there's matches now every night. And I'm not sure I'm going to watch every match in the Euros, but certainly it's enough football in the evening. So, but we're going to do it on the Thursday when there's no matches. So that's Thursday, the 24th of June. And you can say the subscription thing, Catherine.
Yeah, so we know the next thing. And also, this is not it's a bonus one for this season, but we do plan to come back in the fall.
Yes.
But yeah, this was, so we know what we're doing next, which is that Mariam is coming on, and so we're excited about that. We want to thank you, Tom, so much for coming in. This has been amazing. All right.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's been a ton of fun, and great to talk about the ideas and have a bit of a platform to plug things, of course. But great questions.
Well, you earned it. I mean, you gave, like, one of the busiest men alive gave us an hour and a half. Like more than an hour and a half of your time. You can plug something if you want, but thank you so much for that. And so the other thing that we always say, and also we always say, please, it does open up more opportunities for us that we will over time take more advantage of as you like and subscribe. So we appreciate that. We also appreciate that it's like coming into a talk and you've got a whole bunch of people smiling at you in the front row that you even like before they, they think come in and you come in, and if you look, they've already liked things before they start. It's like, nice. I just like that you're doing this, but it feels like coming into a talk with a bunch of smiling faces. So thank you for liking before, or after is also nice. So thank you for joining us and liking and subscribing. And thank you again, Tom. And we'll see you in 2 weeks with Maram.
Yeah, cool. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
I have ended the stream.